It's still hard to believe how lucky we were to be able to claim now that we saw George Best, especially in this city, okay, which was an unknown place at that time, okay? Nobody came here to do anything. And then this guy is here, and he left a trail of good memories and bad memories. You know, he got married here, his kids, Callum was born here. So there's good memories and bad memories that are always going to be talked about, but we were just incredibly lucky to have that guy play here. I mean, every time I go to Europe, especially the UK, and I tell people, yeah, I saw the George Best when I was a kid, the whole conversation just stops. They look at me like they don't even believe that I've heard of George Best, first of all, okay, and then but to say that we saw this guy. And I have friends my age who went to soccer camp, and George Best was there helping run the soccer camp. I mean, this is like in suburban San Jose in 1980 or 81. You know, it's unbelievable that that guy was even here and that we can still say that.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Okay, it's that time again. How you doing, everybody? It's Tim Hanlon, your humble and congenial host for yet another fun-filled episode of that curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports. We like to call it Good Seats Still Available, and I welcome you to our latest chapter in our journey together in the world of forgotten sports. And today we are focused on the San Jose Earthquakes of today of Major League Soccer that rattle around in that beautiful 18,000-plus seat stadium called Avaya Stadium just outside of downtown San Jose, one of the more successful franchises in Major League Soccer. But most fans of the team today probably know that the team clearly has a long and colorful history that dates back all the way to 1974 with the expansion of the then fledgling original North American Soccer League. And that is the journey that we're going to be discussing today, that journey from the starting point in 74 when it really took the NASL by storm in terms of huge attendances and the love affair with the community of San Jose, literally and figuratively putting San Jose on the map at a time when it was really known as more being a suburban enclave for the Bay Area than a metropolitan area per se. And that is the journey from 74 until its current incarnation today of the San Jose Earthquakes that is the topic with our guest today, author and journalist, San Jose native Gary Singh, who has written basically, I think, the sort of definitive tome about the history of the San Jose Earthquake. It's called San Jose Earthquakes, a Seismic Soccer Legacy. Came out a couple of years back, and we're going to sort of walk through a little bit of that journey, that history, that colorful history of the San Jose Earthquakes with Gary Singh, our guest, in just a couple of seconds. We want to remind you that we are brought to you again by our friends at Audible, who remind you that a 30-day free trial of the Audible service, which includes, of course, a free audiobook download for you to try and to enjoy, is available for you to have, not to hold, of course, but to listen to at audibletrial.com/goodseats. Why don't you give that a try? And that's where you'll get a free 30-day trial, as we said, as well as a free audiobook download from a vast library of 180,000 plus titles. I dare you not to find something that's not worthy of your time. And again, at audibletrial.com/goodseats, that's the place where you can get that free audiobook download and a free month's worth, he says, of the Audible service. So you can cancel at any time. It's essentially a no-risk proposition. So I don't know why you wouldn't want to consider doing it. And feel free to do so. We appreciate you trying it. And we also appreciate the folks that have done so already and have enjoyed, as I do and have, audiobooks from Audible. Okay, let us smoothly segue into our very interesting conversation with author, a journalist, a longtime San Jose resident, Gary Singh, the author of the San Jose Earthquakes, a Seismic Soccer Legacy, and our little journey into the history of the team that is today, of course, still known and previously was known as the San Jose Earthquakes. Coming up.
I feel like I was born into the story. I may have stumbled through a few decades of it, but I think if you were a kid in San Jose in the 70s, I think everyone would agree that, this wasn't a very exciting place to grow up in. I mean, it wasn't a crisis-filled, disastrous war zone or anything, but, it was good old-fashioned American suburbia, There was no professional sports. There was a minor league baseball team, the lineage of which is now the San Jose Giants, but back then it was the Bees. And there wasn't a whole lot to do here, and I said some of this in the book, but, there was a few shopping. If you were a kid, you went to the shopping mall or you went to Frontier Village, it really wasn't anything to do, and then when that team arrived, there had already been, a team in the Bay Area, the Oakland Clippers, and the NASL had existed in the other parts of the country. But that team was essentially the first thing that, we ever had here that was exciting to go do. Okay, San Jose State had some football teams, and they had a world-renowned track team in the 60s before I was born, But so the Earthquakes came along, and the whole generation of us just grew up with that team. There's so many stories, and then the whole thing collapsed in '84, and then I grew into a teenager pretty much right after that. And then went to college. I was a music student and an art student and all this stuff, and then still following what was left of pro soccer, even though it was basically amateur pub league kind of stuff. And then MLS came along, and in between all of this, I was working at Spartan Stadium as a concessions dude, either selling peanuts in the crowd as a teenager or later working in the concession stands, setting them up while I was also in college. And so my whole life has been inseparable from Spartan Stadium to this point. And then I ended up becoming a writer and a journalist, and then that was about right when Landon Donovan got here, and then the whole thing just unfolded that way. And then, still no one being able to predict whether this team or the league was even going to exist that much longer. And then finally, when it became apparent that there would be a stadium, finally, after almost 40 years at that point, then it became a perfect idea pretty much at the last minute, to write an overview of the entire history and then put it all out there for the fans. And I wrote it for the fans. I didn't write it for myself, so that's the short version.
Well, okay, so let's talk about those fans, right? Because your chronicle here of this story, right? The San Jose Earthquakes, right, as an entity, it kind of had almost three distinctly different sensibilities to them. Name, yes, but clearly they were distinct and different parts of history borrowing or using that name, as you, I'm sure, discovered as you went back in time to the beginning days of this franchise. And maybe that's another sort of good place to sort of put a push pin into our conversation is maybe you could sort of set the scene a little bit based on, obviously you were just a mere zygote, I think, at this time, but circa late 1973, early 1974, you had this fledgling, or now again fledgling, North American Soccer League, looking to expand westward. And it seemed like there was like three teams that were pretty much kind of good to go to expand this league, with the exception of the Bay Area. And I guess San Francisco was sort of the idea, but it kind of didn't sort of pan out that way. Maybe that's a good place to kind of circle around the beginnings of what became the first incarnation of the Earthquakes franchise.
Yeah, as far as I know, there was some mysterious group of businessmen in San Francisco that thought they had an idea to put a team somewhere. I don't know who they were. I don't know the details, but the way that I discovered the story is, just from talking to all these characters over the last few 20 years or whatever, is that, again, if you grew up here, there was no team here. This was suburbia, okay? There was nobody in San Francisco or Oakland ever conceived of the idea that San Jose would grow into anything except, a cannery backwater. There was a lot of canneries here, in agriculture and whatnot. So no one had any idea, even people in San Jose, no one had any idea that this would ever grow into a city that anybody would want to go to. Okay, but Dick Berg was the promotions guy for the 49ers. He was the guy that was in charge of essentially the halftime circuses that went on. They had connections to Marine World to go bring a bunch of animals on the field and have elephant rides and buffaloes and all sorts of wacky, crazy stuff. And he was part of the conversations that helped the team move from Kezar into Candlestick. And then when the whole idea of the NASL bringing a franchise here, he came along, partnered with Milan Mandrich, who was basically the guy who started the club, I don't know whose idea it was initially, but the beginning of it was that they did not want to be yet another professional team in San Francisco or yet another professional team in Oakland. They wanted to be the first team in this city called San Jose because they saw that there was a future here for professional sports. Okay, now nobody knew what was going to happen or how long this was going to last. Okay, but that was a very visionary way of looking at things. Like no one anywhere in the world outside San Jose believed these guys. Okay, they were really kind of ahead of their time, even thinking that there would be a successful professional sports team here.
Well, you've been almost essentially a lifelong resident, sort of the Bay Area. Perhaps you could get a little deeper into, for our audience who's either not familiar or have never been to the area, about sort of which I guess you could call an inferiority complex of San Jose. It feels, I guess, a tad bit sort of back in the day, probably a bit more suburban, even, or ex-urban, but yet it's still close to the Bay Area. So it seems like a kind of Jekyll Hyde kind of identity, no?
Yeah, it's more or less. That definitely was the case in the set. I mean, for those of you that don't live around here, I mean, San Francisco has historically been the main city, okay, and then we're sort of like Tacoma is to Seattle, okay, if you want to use that comparison. It's not exactly the same thing, but that's in the sense of we're the southernmost city of the Bay Area that has always lived in the shadow of San Francisco. And this is in the 70s I'm talking about. Right. So that was generally the attitude. The majority of people that lived here were here because they wanted to live in the suburbs. They had no desire. They were unapologetically uninterested in anything urban. Okay, this is why they lived here. They wanted to raise a family in the suburbs and then just do all the things that you do in the suburbs. So because of that, it was very hard for any serious attention to be placed on San Jose. It was always in the shadow of San Francisco. If you were a rock band from San Jose in the 60s, you weren't allowed to, you couldn't even tell people you were from San Jose. You had to say, well, I'm from San Francisco. You couldn't, because nobody anywhere knew where San Jose was. This is still the case in a lot of respects. Okay, so that all of this led to an identity complex. And I think the county that we're in, Santa Clara County, their motto, like in the 50s, was something like, we're 45 miles south of San Francisco. Okay, so there was always this inbred embarrassment of being from here. Okay, this is much, much better now. It's not that way anymore. Okay, sure. But back then, this was sort of the attitude.
So what do you think Berg then in particular saw in San Jose then as potentially fertile ground, I guess, for a professional franchise? Was he from the area? What was the glimmer in his eye that he saw outside of that area?
He saw that as the 49ers were moving from Kezar into Candlestick, which was, I don't know, 70 or 71, he ran the numbers and saw that the majority of the fans were still coming from the peninsula or the South Bay. This is even in 1970 or so. Okay, so he saw that, and he saw that Candlestick was right off the freeway rather than having to drive into San Francisco and go find, where Kezar was. I mean, he saw that there was a mass amount of people from the South Bay and the peninsula coming up into San Francisco already. So he said, well, wait a minute, if we just put a team and a sport down there, the numbers of people are already there. It sounds ridiculously simple now, okay, but back then it was still a kind of a backwater place that no one really didn't appear on the radar that much. And then he saw that the numbers of people were down here living in San Jose and that they would support the team, and he was right.
So it based on what I've been able to tell, right? So it may be sort of curious as to sort of how this actually finally occurred, but it seems to me that Commissioner Woosnam of the NASL, was like most people from outside the area, looking at the San Francisco area, either San Francisco or Oakland, probably more San Francisco, I'm gathering, as the place. But it feels like that Berg was the guy that not only influenced Woosnam, but Mandarich, the owner of the team, to actually take this show into San Jose. And I got to think that took a fair bit of song and dance to make that happen.
Yeah, I don't know exactly what the song and dance was, but I think the league didn't care where the team played physically. They just wanted the name to be San Francisco, and Woosnam obviously is no longer with us, so I don't know what happened. Berg, I talked to him when I wrote the book, but he was, I think his health is not as good as it used to be. So, but I don't know if you can still track him down. But I think, the league didn't care if the team played 100 miles away. They just wanted it called San Francisco because it had more name recognition, and that makes sense, but I don't know. I think they just convinced they had a meeting somewhere in Toronto or Rochester. It's in the book. I forget which place it was, but and then Berg and Mandarich went there, and they had to convince the whole board of directors, and Lamar Hunt, of all people, was the person that they had to basically convince. He didn't think this was a great idea. And I think just from what I've been told and what Berg said, I think is that, they made a point of bringing up the fact that, well, when the Oakland Raiders first came here, nobody had heard of Oakland. Everyone thought this was some backwater city where there would be no sports, needed. And that was wrong. Okay. So I think they just brought up the Raiders situation and said, well, look, okay, this was proven a success here. So, and then at that point, the A's were already winning the World Series almost, so I think that was part of it, but I don't know the other details other than that.
So I think it's interesting context, right? Because this is 1974, right? The NASL had pretty much been close to death's door for the years prior to that. And in 1974, This was an effort to expand by 8 clubs, right? So on the West Coast, Vancouver, Seattle, Los Angeles, perhaps this quote unquote San Francisco thing, plus teams also in the East, well, Denver, Boston, Washington, and Baltimore, right? So this is really sort of the nationalization, I guess, or the re-nationalization of the North American Soccer League. And of all those franchises, the San Jose Earthquakes come on strong and just take the league by storm, don't they, in their first year?
Yeah, the first couple of years we had, now again, this is a long time ago, so 17,000 people does not seem like a huge attendance figure, okay, nowadays. But that said, okay, there was no other team in this league was drawing more than like 6,000 or 7,000 a game at that point, okay, so this is before the Cosmos had won anything. Before Pele, before any of that stuff had happened. Okay, but this is before all of that. So the first year that the Quakes existed was 74, and they just filled. And again, this is entirely because it was the first thing that ever happened here. Okay, and Berg had a marketing skill that he had inherited from his work with the Niners. I think he was in Seattle before that. So he combined with the way they marketed the team with Crazy George and the way they went and took to the streets and had all the players go out to the shopping malls and meet people and come to your soccer practices. And everybody knew who the players were. And that combined with it being the first sporting thing that we ever had here, first pro sports team that we ever had here. So that it was really a huge thing, and the rest of the league saw this and they just said, well, wait a minute, okay, if these clowns in some backwater suburb can do this, then we can do this too, and then so a lot of other teams started to engage the fan base a lot more and market the team a lot more. And then again, this is still a relatively brand new sport at this time in America, so everyone had to go out and sell the game to people, and the Quakes are basically who started the idea of the rest of the league guerrilla marketing the sport to the streets of their city.
Yeah, our previous chat with Paul Child, who was also part of that 1974 initial team and stayed for quite a few years, was probably the first breakout star, leading the league actually in scoring that first year. But he recounts quite a bit of pressing the flesh, so to speak, and then going out into the community and doing clinics and signing autographs and all that kind of stuff. The Shakers Dance Squad. And, it really seems like Berg truly, and Mandarich too, as owner, right, truly emphasized a real connection with the community and making it really seem like this was San Jose's true and only professional sports team and worth not only connecting with, but coming out to the games.
Yeah, and if you were a fan, especially if you were a kid, that's exactly what it was. There was no sense of having rock star players. There were so many different components that went into the game event. Okay, everybody would tailgate on the grass next to the stadium. Beforehand, the players would be driving in. The players would come out and hang out with the fans at their tailgate beforehand, and then they would go in and have the game. Everybody would go in before the kickoff even started because everyone wanted to see what Crazy George was going to be doing at the game. And so there was this huge, play-by-play thing going on before the game even started, and then the game started, and every game is like jam-packed. And, it was like a stadium rock show if you were a kid. Everybody was just thundering and waiting to see waiting for the game to start. And then afterward, everybody's out back at their tailgates, and the players themselves come back out to go drink with everybody afterwards. Okay, it was completely an unheard of situation and how close the fans were to the players. There were, to a degree, the Raiders did some things like this in the 70s too. They would be out at the bars, getting trashed. Stabler has all sorts of legendary, stories and stuff. But in this case, the fans were directly connected to the players. Everybody was like one giant family, and they would come to your practices. If you were a kid playing soccer, they would come to your house for dinner. It was this is like unheard of stuff, and they really connected with the community on that level. And that's essentially what made it so popular at first.
Well, so it sounded like it was fun, and I guess obviously soccer is part of it too, but maybe you could describe what Spartan Stadium was like. So you talked about tailgating and whatnot, but a couple of things. One, you saw see some of these earlier photos where the field itself was painted in the sort of earthquake colors. And maybe besides that, you could also maybe describe for our audience who has not benefited by hearing our previous episode with Crazy George Henderson, who he was and why he was a big deal in the stands too.
Yeah, there's I can answer all of that. Let's see. Spartan Stadium is at this time the capacity is probably about 17,000 people. It's an old, broken down, rickety, decrepit, falling apart stadium. It was built in like the 30s on a dirt hill, about a mile south of the campus. Again, all of this is suburbia, okay, and it seats about 17,000 people on wooden benches, and, the locker rooms are run down and falling apart, 1960s era stuff. The bathrooms are these old, like multiple person troughs that you take a leak in, okay, at least the guys, okay, the whole place was just a dilapidated venue, but in a glorious way. Okay, and American football field is much, much skinnier than a soccer field. Okay, for those of you that don't follow soccer. Okay, so a soccer field is much wider and much longer. Okay, it's a lot larger. So, and because Spartan Stadium was such a tight, compact place with a very narrow field for soccer, the fans could basically line the barricades and look over onto the field, and you were only like 20 feet away from the players on the field. You could yell at the opposing players. You could scream at them. You could hear everybody on all the players in the field yelling. You could basically, you could verbally abuse the other players. There was relatively no security, okay? So if you were a kid, you could walk down the ramp and stand behind the goal and catch the balls. During the game, you were allowed to bring your own beer into the stadium. You could bring a nice chest of beer. That was legal. The vendors walking through the stand still sold beer. You could still do that. It was just a whole different era. And Crazy George is what sort of tied the whole thing together. He was basically a cheerleader from San Jose State in the late 60s, early 70s, and did some work for California Seals hockey team. And he was about 30 when all of this started, 1974. Yeah, he's about 72 or 73 now. So he was the cheerleader that had the snare drum, and he would lead the crowd to do all these just crazy chants and mass, forms of ridiculing the opposing players. And so this was all of which together was, a good old-fashioned home field advantage. I mean, the opposing teams hated to play here. I mean, it was just the worst place. And because it's a small field and the fans are surrounding the field, it almost feels like indoor soccer when you're playing there. And for the opposing team, it's like having to walk into a cage with all these people and all this noise just straight on top of you. And it was just, again, it was a true home field advantage. And they really don't have that anywhere these days.
So it must have been a hell of a lot of fun. And by the way, for your completists out there, if you haven't listened to the Crazy George Henderson episode, that's episode number 7. So go to goodseatsstillavailable.com and search for that episode. You will not be disappointed. And you will hear Crazy George is still, in all his craziness, even as his advanced age, he's an absolute treasure and treat to listen to and hear stories from. But it's interesting. So you mentioned all that sort of fun stuff. And I got to imagine, even as a kid, it's got to be even more wondrous. The team actually did pretty well on the field, right? They in their very first season, right, came in second in their division. They lost in the quarterfinals of the playoffs, right? They're leading the league by a ton in attendance, and they had the leading scorer in Paul Child for the league. I think about, on all accounts, right, it seems like it was a pretty successful start, maybe to the surprise not only of the community but to the league itself.
Yeah, we didn't go until the first couple seasons after they had started. So so everything I'm telling you now is still true as of 76, 77 and stuff. Okay, but the first couple of years they were hugely successful, and that led to them, or the NASL, awarding San Jose the Soccer Bowl, which was the championship game. In 75, okay, I think that was the first time they even called it the Soccer Bowl, and they were trying to basically use all the domestic American sports terminology to try and help sell the game. Okay, so Soccer Bowl was just a stupid name to begin with, but that's just what that was part of having to try and sell the sport, so. So that it was huge, and all these people were coming to San Jose. Pele came to play here twice. I came to play here twice, and everybody was here. And this had never happened. Nothing like this had ever happened here before. So that's what made it. And it's not. I mean, sometimes those of us that tell these stories, we get criticized because they think it's just a bunch of people telling their childhood memories and exaggerating everything from a child's perspective. But I mean, you can ask anybody who was an adult at that time, they'll tell you all that I'm saying is they'll tell you the same thing that I'm saying. I mean, it was just this huge thing that exploded and totally captured lightning in a bottle, and unfortunately it just didn't last very long. And there were Milan sold the team, and then because he wanted to go, he didn't want to, the stadium was very small and falling apart, and he saw an idea to go run the Oakland Stompers, so he did that, which didn't last either. And then, he came back a few years later, and that's sort of right when George Best showed up. But as everyone knows the story now, but it was, as kids, it was just a fantastic thing to grow up with.
Okay, friends, sorry for the interruption. Just wanted to quickly remind you that today's episode of Good Seats Still Available is brought to you by our friends at Audible, the premier provider of digital audiobooks with over 180,000 titles to choose from in just about every genre you could think of. Audible titles play on iPhone, Kindle, Android, and more than 500 devices and MP3 players for listening anytime, anywhere. And for a limited time, my audience can listen to a free download of any book that they choose, as well as get a 30-day free trial when you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats. That's audibletrial.com/goodseats. And you can choose from over 180,000 titles, as we said, including one that I'm listening to right now. It's called The 10-Gallon War by John Eisenberg. That's the story of the NFL's Cowboys, the AFL's Texans, and the feud for Dallas's pro football future. Another one on my list, which I have yet to download but is on my queue, that could be interesting to our audience here, is called The National Forgotten League by Dan Daly, entertaining stories and observations from pro football's first 50 years. Those are just two of the many thousands of titles to choose from, and not just in sports history, but you name the genre that you might want to listen to, and Audible's got it. By the way, two guests perhaps that we'll have on the show, hopefully sometime soon. But again, go to audibletrial.com/goodseats for your free 30-day trial, as well as your free audiobook download to try it out for yourself. Again, that's audibletrial.com/goodseats. And now, back to our conversation. Well, okay, so it's clear that those first couple of years were quite something, and actually quite competitive on the field, too. It wasn't like they were just there for the party, right? Yeah. The crowds were growing. So maybe we could talk about 77, because after that season, right, which was sort of the last season of Pele, and was really on the verge of taking the league even to a grander level, at least for a couple more years thereafter, Mandarich decides to divest his ownership of the Quakes and buy another team in Connecticut and move them up to Oakland, right, in the same, metropolitan area, and create a new team called the Stompers, as you mentioned. What do you think, based on what you were able to discern, what was going through Mandarich's head, given that his exploits in San Jose were, frankly, pretty darn successful? Why would he want to give all that up and try something completely different? What was the allure of Oakland, and was it simply a stadium thing, or was there something else going on?
I don't know the complete answer to that. I do know the people that do know the answer, but I think, he wanted a larger stadium. He thought that, I don't think he ever figured that Spartan Stadium would get the modern infrastructure that he needed. And I can't say this for certain, but I think there may have been something in the contract that if the Quakes had ended up falling apart, that he had an option to buy the team back or something. I don't know if that's exactly what happened, but then, I can't say for sure, but there was definitely something going on where I think he wanted to divest this situation and then start something new in Oakland. I mean, I don't really know the details on that.
Yeah, I also can't imagine, too, why another team in the immediate vicinity, right? I know certainly Major League Baseball has its issues when it fights between, the rights of the Bay Area between the Giants and the A's, and who's going to move down to San Jose someday, et cetera. But in a fledgling league, granted growing and getting up to 24 teams by 1978, even I would sort of question, why would you put a team that's but 45 miles away, in the Bay Area, especially given something that you said before was lightning in a bottle and been largely successful and wildly so in the city of San Jose.
I don't know. I honestly don't know the answer. I think the stadium was a huge part of it. That's just what I'm guessing. He just saw there was a huger stadium there, and there was more. I don't know. This goes into the theme of the whole book is that San Jose is still struggling to be taken seriously as a real city and a real destination, and he probably just thought he could get more fans to show up if it was in Oakland. That's always been an issue. So that's part of it. Other than that, I really don't know the deal. I should know all of this, but but on that particular detail, I don't really know. Paul Child would know that. Johnny Moore would know all this, and Milan's still around. But I don't really. I don't know the details.
Well, Milan Mandarich,
I would answer. I just don't know.
No, that's okay. Well, Milan Mandarich is definitely somebody we'd love to get at some point. So at some point, we've got to put our heads together and figure out how we can get him here on this here big show. But okay. So as the team sort of meanders, it seems that by the way, that Oakland Stompers exercise only lasted 1 year. They were a 1-year wonder, replete with Shep Messing and the Cork Poppers dance team. Yes, you could look it up. Someday we'll devote an episode to that one. But it seems that in the early 80s, sort of a new sort of sensibility, I guess, around the team kind of came about, right? You mentioned probably one of the more notable experiments, and that was a guy by the name of George Best, who in 1981, his second year with the team, right, and his third team overall in the league, right, having sort of drank his way through two previous franchises. And that's also another episode that when we talked about the documentary devoted to his life, we talk about that. But there is, George Best did inject quite a bit of zing, even though in his advancing years and, shall we call it, not so stable personal life, completed what arguably was considered to be the best ever goal scored in the league. And if you look it up on YouTube, the date was July 22nd, 1981. And I'm sure, you remember some of this as you were putting the book together, but he dances through it seems like 7, 8, 9 players with the ball, almost like a yo-yo at his feet, and puts in the back of the net. And it's truly something to see. And the fans just go wild. It almost seems like a defining moment of the early 80s of that franchise about how exciting, if not surprising, his performance and the team was in those days.
Yeah, I mean, you have to understand that the team was relatively terrible at that time, and of course, I have friends who were on the team who were going to crucify me for saying that. But the team was not particularly very, especially in 1980. They were really bad, and then he came along, and and he's got his own issues, as everyone knows. So he's just trying to prove that he can still play more than anything. If he was there, especially for that goal, and that goal wasn't the only spectacular thing he did. You could watch the guy and you could just see that obviously, he's well past his prime, but he just had flashes of, incomparable genius to where he could literally just, there were moments when he would just deliberately walk around with the ball for 2 minutes and nobody could take it away from them. People, you could tell the defenders would be thinking look, just get this over with, just score or give it to somebody else or something. He would deliberately try and just embarrass the guys on the other team. And he was like somebody showing off in a bar. This is the same way, same thing. He did on the field. It's unbelievable. It's still hard to believe how lucky we were to be able to claim now that we saw George Best, especially in this city, okay, which was an unknown place at that time. Okay, nobody came here to do anything. Okay, and then this guy is here and he left a trail of good memories and bad memories. He got married here. His kids, Callum, was born here. So there's good memories and bad memories that are always going to be talked about. But we were just incredibly lucky to have that guy play here. Every time I go to Europe, especially the UK, and I tell people, yeah, I saw George Best when I was a kid. The whole conversation just stops. They look at me like they don't even believe that I've heard of George Best. First of all, okay, and then but to say that we saw this guy. And I have friends my age who went to soccer camp, and George Best was there helping run the soccer camp. This is in suburban San Jose in 1980 or 81, and it's just unbelievable that guy was even here and that we can still say that.
And we go deep into the George Best story, and that's episode 24 in our previous episode. So look for that too, kind listeners. But it almost seems too that it was almost emblematic of the franchise at that point, right? Circa 1981, right? Where strangely, it seems when Mandarich sort of left the Quakes, it almost seemed like the team kind of left with him, so to speak, because you were talking about how terrible the team was. They didn't qualify for the playoffs pretty much consistently until, for many years, through about that time. And frankly, it wasn't even until, I guess, sort of the last sort of gasp in the 82, 83, and 84 seasons, right? Honestly, the same last seasons of the NASL itself, when the team actually had some flickers of success again. Yeah. Like in 83, right? It went 20-10, a pretty darn good record. But largely you had this sort of, you had an influx of players and a coach from the MISL, Don Popovich and Steve Jungle and Branko Sugoda, right? And two, the name changed as well, which probably reflected, I guess, the changing nature of what San Jose was. In general, as well as for the league itself. Maybe you can stumble across what you sort of saw the last things were there in those last couple of years. Yeah, the name change, for those of you that don't know those stories, the name change
plays right into all the themes of, inferiority complex and geographic dislocation and having no name recognition. And all of that played into the, I forget even who it was. It was either Carlberg or I think it was him that wanted to basically, they changed the name from San Jose to Golden Bay Earthquakes, okay? And everybody still called them the San Jose Earthquakes. No one, if you're covering the story as a reporter, you had to say Golden Bay, but everyone still called them the Earthquakes, San Jose Earthquakes, and it was just, there's no such place as Golden Bay. It doesn't exist, okay? There's no place that's called that, okay? But it was just some dorky, idiotic attempt to try and dumb down it all plays into inferiority complex, and the city of San Jose itself doesn't have enough name recognition, so they want to call it the Golden Bay Earthquakes so they can at least try and reel in the East Bay fans when they were doing the indoor games, which were in the Oakland Coliseum anyway. Okay, so that's how it all played into it. And it was just a really stupid idea.
It sounds like a little regional. It was sort of like regionalization, right? So not unlike, say, Tampa Bay, right, which is also a manufactured mythical.
Yeah, the whole idea was widely ridiculed, and it was a colossal failure of an idea. But anyway, wiser heads eventually prevailed, and even after the NASL had folded and then Bridgewater acquired the, probably just verbal rights to carry on the name, he called it San Jose again. Okay, that was, he understood this, okay, whereas Carlberg is the guy who owned the team, is not a sports person. He doesn't know anything about stuff. He's so he doesn't understand anything about the history of the club and the heritage and the city. Then you're born into the team, and Bridgewater's from Europe, so he understands all of this. So he just immediately said, forget that. We're going to go back to calling it the San Jose Earthquakes, and but it was just a temporary stupid decision. And I remember I grew up as a kid being really interested in geography. Okay, I knew all the state capitals, I knew all the world capitals. I was a worldly kid. Okay, and then to have and I remember thinking I was probably about 14. Okay, and I remember thinking that was just the stupidest thing I'd ever heard in my life, to change the name of my team to something called Golden Bay when it didn't even exist, first of all. So I think I'm echoing everybody's opinion on this, but it was just, the team was great. We had Jungle, and then, and the 83 team was probably the best team in the league at that year, even though we didn't go on to win it that year. But, some really good players, and then the writing was already on the wall at that point. Everyone pretty much knew. They were losing teams every year. Teams were folding, and then by the time 85 came around, I think they were trying to salvage what they could, but they had, I think they had Minnesota and Vancouver, and then even the Cosmos had to kick it in because I think Canalia had some problems or something. But anyway, and that was the end of it.
Well, you mentioned Peter Bridgewater, right? Who at the time in '84 was the general manager, and whether he bought the team or just kind of was the last one holding the bag when the door was closing. Maybe you can kind of describe his role, because it seems like post '84 and the death of the NASL shortly thereafter, that he kind of sort of kept some of the pieces together and arguably then kind of let that blend into what sort of became sort of the second era of the Earthquakes, even though it wasn't fully the Earthquakes yet, which was this diaspora known as the San Francisco Bay Blackhawks, right? Which was, I guess, the local entry into the minor leagues, or the Division II or Division III leagues that kind of just stumbled across for the years afterwards to kind of keep the sport alive in this country, albeit in piecemeal fashion. You want to kind of talk about sort of the whimpering effects of what the Earthquakes used to be at that point, and then sort of what they primordially sort of evolved to and reconstituted in the years shortly thereafter?
Yeah, this is where it gets really confusing. But basically, the NASL folded for good, and the 84 was the last season. At the beginning of 85, Clive Toy and all those guys were just still trying to salvage something, but it just didn't happen. Okay, anyway, so then Bridgewater acquired the rights to carry on the Earthquakes name and the logo and the colors. I'm pretty sure that was just the owners saying, go ahead and do it. I mean, there was no legal documents drawn up or anything as far as I know. They probably just got drunk and said, go ahead and take it. I don't care, or something. So and then Bridgewater became the person essentially responsible for he was the main hero keeping all of this alive in the Bay Area. Okay. And then he was the one carrying on the Earthquakes name. And he started the Western Soccer Alliance. There's probably people in Seattle that disagree with who started it, but I mean, Bridgewater started it. Okay. First, basically, so he carried it on. And then again, these next few years, it's essentially an amateur team. To even call it semi-pro is even giving them way too much credit. I mean, it was really just a bunch of guys getting paid about $25 a game or something, But he financed or tried to finance it by having all these international exhibition games at Spartan Stadium, and this is when there were a lot of great games. I mean, for the rest of the 80s, I mean, you saw Maradona came here when he was with Napoli. I mean, there were games like, Manchester City, Real Madrid was here again. And then the tickets for this are like, $18 or something like this to see Real Madrid and down the street from where I'm living right now. Okay. So he had a lot of awesome international games like that. And then I haven't actually looked at the books that I wrote in about maybe 6 months or so. So I have to go back and look at the details, but I forget, but so this is where it gets kind of tricky. Okay. Whereas Bridgewater was the last owner who owned the Earthquakes in the middle era that we're talking about. Tony, there was some financial difficulties, and then he had to basically give up the club, and then there's several people involved, not just one person. And then at the same time, I could be getting the order wrong here, but Dan Van Voorhees was starting a whole different team in a different league or something. And I have to go back and look at the details.
Yeah, I think Dan Van Voorhees, right? So he's a Bay Area real estate lawyer, right? And he's I think he somehow gets involved with the Hawks, but he also, in the Western Soccer Alliance, and then became the USISL. But he also, though, at the same time, was apparently negotiating or somehow getting involved with the formative rumblings or beginnings of this thing called Major League Soccer, and apparently had the rights to the Bay Area for an MLS franchise, right?
Yeah, he and Bridgewater did not get along at all. They were always at each other's throats about this, about this stuff. But Bridgewater at that time is more concerned with, he's on the World Cup committee to bring the World Cup here in '94. So he's in charge of the Stanford venue. He's dealing with all that stuff. And then, so Van Voorhees has the San Francisco Bay Area Blackhawks, which was a fantastic team. That was 91 was the year that they won the championship of that league. Okay. And that team, you can talk to anybody. Those teams in that era were fantastic. It was Eric Winalda. Well, actually, Callaway was the coach. It was Eric Winalda was here, John Doyle, Marcelo Balboa, Paul Bravo, Dominic Kinnear played for that team. That was like a star-studded team of the best American players that we had at that time, and that was, so they were a great team. And then all of this is happening, and then this is, and he was even, Van Voorhees was even trying to start something with Mexico. Like he was trying to get the Mexican league to combine with some teams on the West Coast in California to have some other joint league. And all these different irons were in the fire. And then he eventually had to basically offload the whole thing to MLS. But he was one of the main people that fought to have San Jose as one of the founding cities in MLS. So he's hugely responsible for that. But due to whatever was going on in this financial situation, he had to offload everything to MLS, and then the team wasn't. And then so basically, the way to simplify it is that the Bay Area, this SF Bay Area Blackhawks, essentially, I'm speaking historically, not legally. The Blackhawks essentially merged with the still percolating history of the Earthquakes to basically form what became the San Jose Clash. That's how I describe it.
Right, and it's also interesting to note that the construct of MLS in the early days, and actually still to this day, is largely that of the early days, it was of an investor operator kind of model, right, where the investor would come in and have effectively rights for a particular franchise, or in the case of Anschutz's group, a number of franchises, but in essence, it would still be actually part of a bigger whole that is for the league. So while you nominally had oversight over a team or a region, you were really becoming an investor in the league. And it seems like that for whatever financial reasons, Van Voorhees, just about at the beginning of the league itself in '96, kind of had to bow out and effectively sell the rights that he had as part of that process back to the league, which basically meant, if I'm not mistaken, and yes, I was at that very first MLS game in San Jose in Spartan Stadium, seeing Eric Winalda score that dramatic late goal in the 88th minute. Yeah. It seems that that the Clash was destined to be sort of league owned for the first couple of years of its existence. But maybe you could talk about the name itself, right? Because Bridgewater wasn't a big fan of the team being named the Clash, was he?
Well, I mean, so let's just go back for a second. Okay, I mean, what I just said before. I mean, I say that for a reason. Okay, like so Van Voorhees basically sold off all the name and the player contracts and everything to MLS, and then Nike is who was their main sponsor, so they chose the names. Okay, they chose the Kansas City. It was Nike and somebody else. I forget. But Nike chose the Clash. Okay, but basically, what I'm interested in. Just as the person who wrote the book and trying to connect all the dots and all this, I mean, if you go to the first season of MLS, okay, the Clash is the name. Nobody, well, I don't want to say nobody, but anyone who grew up with this sport, no one liked the name. Okay, I don't think Bridgewater liked it either, but this is what Nike wanted. And what everyone could immediately see, though, the first year of MLS, for the Clash, you had the president of the team is Bridgewater. Laurie Calloway is the coach. John Doyle is the first player signed. And the TV commentators are Mark Demling and Chris Dangerfield. Okay, so that right there is 4 different levels of continuation from the previous San Jose Earthquakes. So this was obviously a continuation of what we'd all grown up with since 1974. Okay, everybody from here knew that and understood that immediately. Okay, so, but Nike is the one who was able to choose the name, and that's then eventually wiser heads prevailed, and later even if they named it back to the Earthquakes for the wrong reason, at least they did, and a whole lot would have been different if they hadn't have done that.
Well, so in October of '99, after their 4th season, they did indeed change the name back to Earthquakes. But you say for the wrong reasons. Why do you think? Well, it seems to the outsider, right, that it's just a simple deference to the team, to the heritage. But was it just a name only? Was it just a coating of paint, so to speak, or it doesn't seem like there was a lot of roots?
I think Lynn Metropole was the GM at that time, and I think they just had they had some kind of readership, or not readership. I mean, I'm a newspaper guy, so I automatically say readership. They had some kind of fan survey, and that combined with a bunch of idiotic, consultants that they were working with, and I don't know. So eventually, she came to the idea, well, we should just change it back to the Earthquakes because the team is not doing very well. They're a pretty terrible team, and maybe they're just jinxed because I don't know. But I think she just finally made a decision one day and just walked out of the office and said, we're going to do this, and I don't think she did it out of any kind of knowledge of any massive amount of history like we've been just talking about. I think she just, it was just after talking to the fans and saying, okay, well, maybe this is just a better thing to do. And then The team was still horrible the next year, so it didn't change anything. But
the year after,
I think they had a consultant who made them realize that blue jerseys sell more than this gaudy, awful thing that they were wearing, the class was wearing. So they did that, and again, this is details that I don't really remember, but
well, indeed,
this would have been too much to include in the book anyway.
Well, no, but clearly they did start to catch fire the following year, and I don't think, again, it's because of the name change back to Earthquakes, but with a new coach in Frank Yallop and an assistant coach in Dominic Kinnear and a new allocation in the name of Landon Donovan, right? The fortunes dramatically change in 2001, literally for the last number of years of its second incarnation as the Earthquakes. They truly became one of the, if not the league's leading teams over the next 5 years. And the Earthquakes name, not a bad association given that.
Well, I think the Earthquakes name was definitely part of it. I mean, I think a lot more people identified with it, at least the people who had grown up with the team and or the original team and had suffered through this idiotic name of the class and these horrible 1990s shopping mall emo kind of jerseys that they had. At least we were glad that they were at least calling it the Earthquakes, and then from 01 to 05, I would definitely say that we were the best team in the league over those 5 years. I mean, not just by statistics, but I think we definitely were. They were a really fun team to watch. It wasn't just a bunch of guys booting the ball upfield and dump and chase, hockey style. I mean, it was they had the ball on the ground the whole game. It was possession soccer. They were some really interesting characters playing on the team that had their own personalities on the field, the way that they played. The starting lineup was essentially the same starting lineup most of the games in a row. It was a really great, family of a team, and they all got along. Most of them got along off the field, and if there was any player that came into the team and had a chip on his shoulder and tried to act like a punk and thought he was bigger than the team, they would just get rid of him and say, "That's it, you're out of here." And everybody kind of went out and supported each other, and it was everything that you wanted from a team, from a professional football or soccer team at that time, and again, this is still 01, 02, 03, 04, so people still aren't sure if the league is even going to last, that much longer. Nobody knows at this point. And then Landon had essentially the entire future of the sport dumped onto his back, whether he wanted it or not, wanted to be that person or not. So he's getting tugged in a million different directions. People want him to go to Europe and play over there, and, he doesn't know he's only 20 years old, so he doesn't know how to deal with all this, but he was definitely the best player we had in the U.S. to that point, at least at that time. And again, this is like to say that I was a kid growing up in this stadium and seeing George Best play on that field, and then, 20 years later, here I am, a journalist, watching Landon Donovan, who's the best player that we have in the country, play on that field right there. It was just, it was the most blessed feeling I could possibly have. It was just amazing that the whole thing came full circle to that point, and then we win 2 championships. And, the history wrote itself. I didn't have to do any work to tell the history on this. It was pretty easy.
Well, yeah, and not only 2 MLS Cups, but a Supporter Shield in 2005. And you also, you saw, a team that, had the biggest turnaround in league history. And there was, it was clearly something, plus the derbies, right, with Los Angeles, right? That's really where this sort of modern day California Classico really got going in earnest. There's some real barn burners of games that happened during that period of time, too, between the Galaxy and
I think it sounds weird to say stuff like, the best turnaround in league history. The league only existed, 5 years.
Fair enough.
But and we're only talking about, I'm saying, I say that too. Okay. But just in retrospect, to put everything in context, even though it was only 2001, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5 years. But during that short amount of time, that the LA San Jose rivalry really was the most intense filled, true, authentic rivalry that this short fledgling league had seen at that point. Okay, nowadays, the situation in up north, Seattle and Portland, has completely overeclipsed it, and that's probably the hugest rivalry in the league. I mean, because that goes back to the 70s, and it's probably completely eclipsed anything that San Jose and LA probably ever was. I mean, but for this 5 years, at that time, 01 to 05, that was like, I mean, we win the championship in 01, they win it in 02, we win it in 03 in their stadium, in their brand new stadium in 03, and then I think DC won the next year, and then we came back in 05 we were the best team in the league easily. We only lost 4 games that year, which is still a record, I think. And then, but they snuck into the into the playoffs, and then we got knocked out, and Landon got the last laugh, and then, they went on to win it. So that absolutely was the best, most intense, and most authentic rivalry, just as much as you can say in just, 5 short years of a 20-year league so far. But yeah, it was just fun to be a part of.
Well, all right. So despite all that success on the field, it's clear, though, that behind the scenes, right, the bubbling up of more, shall we say, financial and ownership issues started to really play out. I mean, obviously, you saw Frank Yallop leave to become the national coach of Canada, and Dominic Kinnear became the head coach. But I think it's also important to remember that the Anschutz Group was still, AEG, was still the owner of this team, effectively an owner of a number of teams keeping this league going. And it was pretty clear that they were actively trying to sell off this team, or at least disperse of some of the teams that they own, so that they could spread out the ownership across the league. And in 2004, despite a pretty good run of success on the field, you had a bunch of things happening, including the general manager, Johnny Moore, resigning. You had this idea, which I didn't even know about. The AEG apparently was close to selling the team to Club America of Mexico and renaming the team San Jose America. How did that come about? I mean, it almost presages what Chivas became later on, but wow, that would have been a monstrosity.
Both of those ideas were percolating at the same time, So, I mean, AEG didn't want to be in this market. It's not their market. They don't know anything about this market. They don't care. They just didn't. They figured they could. Eventually, they realized, well, they had a better opportunity to get a stadium in Houston that they didn't have to pay for, and that won't happen in California. No one will vote to have a stadium built with any kind of public money. It just won't. People won't vote for that here. It'll get lost by a landslide, So they weren't going to have anything like that happen around here. But right before that, they were trying to shop the team to San Antonio. They were trying to sell it, as you say, to Club America from Mexico City. And so if they had bought the team, they would have either kept it here or moved it to Houston and renamed it something else. I mean, so there was a lot of things like that. But then Johnny Moore was who you can say basically is the Earthquakes. He's like the guy who's been here since it started. They started, him and Dick Berg started the club in a hotel room in the Hyatt on First Street, the Hyatt Hotel. That's where they first figured out how to start the business. Okay, so he's been there since the beginning. He's like the fan favorite who is now returned as general manager, and he just he didn't want his club, and he if there's any person in the world who can say it, this is his club. It's Johnny can say that, And so as the general manager in 2003 or 4, at this time. So, and then once he heard that they were planning to essentially sell the whole franchise to Club America and remove and destroy all the history that Johnny helped build from day one, he just sort of like threw his ball in front of the tracks and said, "I'm done. I'm out of here," and which pretty much helped derail that whole deal. But I can't say that. I can't say legally for sure if it derailed the whole deal. You have to talk to AEG about that, but anyway, they didn't end up doing that deal. And then, so they kept the team here. At the end of 2004, they were going to pull the trigger and move it to Houston, but then a group of people, local fans, banded together and helped to rally the masses and convince AEG to keep it here another year. And then, which they still didn't find a local owner at that point. And so they moved the whole thing to Houston. And then the fans here are the ones who essentially fought to keep the records and the statistics and the trophies and the historical lineage here. The fans are the ones who did that. Okay? If they had not done that, then AG would never have even thought about doing that. The league would never have cared. And then when they did bring a team back here, it probably would have ended up being called something else. I don't know. But the fans are the ones who did that. That's the important thing.
Yeah,
I hope the people in Columbus right now are listening to this, because that is, it's pretty scary what these corporate owners, what these absentee owners who care nothing about the history and the heritage of the club that they're destroying by moving it to some other place, And there's no other situation in any other country in the world where you would move a team somewhere. This is a completely American exception, a belligerent American exceptionalist invention to do this. Okay, it's if you go see how soccer is done anywhere else in the entire world, you're born into the club. You're a fan of that team. It doesn't move somewhere else. Okay, the club and the history are the important thing. Owners come and go, leagues come and go, or you get promoted or relegated into a different league. The owners come and go, corporations come and go. It doesn't matter. Okay? The club is the important thing. Okay, And this guy in Columbus doesn't understand any of this. Okay, AG didn't understand any of this. They probably understand a little bit more now, but it was just the stupidest thing in the history of this league to move that team.
Well, so it almost seems like it could be another story around that thing. So the idea. So it's a couple of things. One, right, the team moves to Houston. Right, AEG moves the team to Houston, and of course, as the Houston Dynamo, they continue to set the league on fire by winning 2 MLS Cup championships and doing very, very well in their first 4 years. Right, and
yippee.
Yeah, well, right. And you got to think, as a jilted fan of the San Jose franchise, right? So, but also you're hinting at, and this requires a little bit of dexterity here. It almost sounds like the Cleveland Browns NFL deal when the new Cleveland Browns were established. It basically sounds like what you're telling me is that the fans were the ones that insisted on not transferring, if you will, all of the heritage onto the Dynamo, but when it was decided that there would be an expansion franchise, that not only would it be named the Earthquakes when it came back, but all of the previous records and heritage and name and logo and colors and all that stuff would revert back, so that in essence the expansion franchise would not be technically the new San Jose Earthquakes franchise in 2008, but would actually be the Houston Dynamo. So it's a little weird if you're not sort of paying attention, right? The real expansion, it was a franchise that moved, that is San Jose to Houston. And then an expansion franchise was named in San Jose again a few years later. Yet the transfer of all the heritage, instead of it going to Houston when they started there, it actually reverted back to San Jose here. So it's interesting as you go back and look at the history and look at the records and stuff to make sure that you understand this little speed bump along the way, I guess.
Yeah, I mean the history and heritage did not get transferred anywhere. The history and the records and the trophies and the statistics and everything remained here, and the fans are who fought for that. Okay, that's the important thing to realize here. Okay, AG would never have done that. The league would never have agreed to even cared about any of that. And so the fans fought for that, and AG said, they said, fine, you can have that. Okay, now it's up in the air whether I think when they moved the franchise to Houston, they were definitely already in the process of trying to figure out how they could return a team here and, launch it in San Jose. Again, okay, they were definitely already trying to figure out how to do that. And in fact, when they announced the move to Houston, they announced that they had already spoken to Lou Wolf and about trying to figure out how to do that. So they were definitely planning to come back here. Okay, but that would have been completely up to the new owner as far as what to call the team or what to do with it. That was not decided. That was not officially guaranteed, or it would not have been guaranteed that the new San Jose team would be called the Earthquakes again. They would probably have left it up to the owner to do that if the fans had not fought to keep the name and the statistics and the championship trophies here. Meaning if we win again, it'll be our third championship, and the records and the stats are all continuous from '96 until through.
All right.
Make sense?
Yeah, it does. So as we sort of round up here, I do want to get through sort of how this occurs, right? Because it seems to the outsider sort of a cynical play. I don't understand, and this is a naive question, why an AEG couldn't have found an Oakland A's owner in Lou Wolf and just dealt with the franchise in that way, exchanged the franchise at that point versus having to dramatically move this to Houston, right? And then Wolf coming in essentially was an expansion franchise and kind of starting from scratch, at least, with a clean slate to rebuild a franchise. Why do you think, or maybe there's just not an answer at this point, why couldn't AEG just get a deal done with Wolf, in 06, or sorry, in 05, 06, versus having to go through all the drama of a team leaving and then another one coming back?
I don't know the answer to that. I think, as we said before, AEG doesn't want, they could have afforded to lose money, Anschutz is a zillionaire. He could afford to lose $100 million a year on the Earthquakes for 100 years. He doesn't care, but I think, I don't know. They didn't want to be in this market. They really saw that Houston had the largest amount of television viewers watching MLS for a city that didn't have a team yet. They just saw that. They knew that land is a lot cheaper down there. They saw that they probably had a way with the politicians who could figure out how to use some public money to help pay for it. So they probably just thought they could get the deal done and just do this and pull the trigger, and not, considering how they had the team for a couple of seasons and then nothing could come of it. I don't think they really tried very hard to look for an owner or anything. I don't think they were ever serious about keeping the team here. They just would rather have somebody who knows the city and knows the Bay Area, knows the market, knows the real estate here, and then maybe Lou Wolf just didn't show up in time. I don't really know. I don't know.
That's interesting. Yeah, well, that's interesting. The local angle seems like it might make sense. And it's interesting, too, that Wolf was given a 3-year option to kind of, in earnest develop a stadium, right, which, as we see now, right, and you're kind of hinting at it with the Columbus situation in MLS currently as we record this, right, it's pretty clear that Major League Soccer is not just about sort of Division I soccer and the quality of such, or the debatable quality of such, we can argue, but is really, almost the lead story is real estate, right? The idea of owning and building these stadiums to control all these revenue streams, right? It's clear that the model of Major League Soccer still, by the way, centrally owned, right? It's not franchised still yet. That the cornerstone of the business model is a stadium in which full or large majority ownership of revenue streams is expected. It's almost this is sort of like maybe the textbook story or example of how that model that currently exists now started to come to be with this Earthquakes franchise situation.
Well, this is the party line that the league will tell you. Seattle doesn't own their state, they're sharing a stadium. everyone talks about how all the great crowds in Portland and Seattle are doing, how much crowds or everyone's talking about, the great crowds that they get up there. Well, they had the luxury of already having a stadium there. They had to either remodel it or they shared it with another professional sport. Okay. I mean, we had to build the whole thing from scratch. Okay. It's not that easy around here to do that. Okay. So the whole thing about requiring every MLS franchise to have a new built stadium for itself, blah, blah, blah. That's essentially just the party line from the league, because that just fits in with, they've always played favorites. They want the teams like Seattle and Portland and Los Angeles to be, they want those teams in those markets to succeed. They don't care if we succeed, this is my opinion, not anybody else's, but, so it's the stadium thing is, they're at the point where it's obviously the franchise model is not working like they or initially were going to think it will. It's basically a domestic American sports franchise model. If you go anywhere else in the world, there's no such thing as these franchises for soccer. The team, they're clubs, not franchises. You own your own club. And if you do good, you get promoted to the next division. And if you do bad, you get relegated. But you own the club, okay? And then the whole city is for the club, and they own the club, okay? Or the owner owns the club. So, and if you want a stadium, it's your club, so you raise the money and you build it, okay? And there's none of this single entity crap or anything, So that's a whole different argument, but. Well,
it's a raw one, and it's certainly something that as soccer fans debate sort of the future of the sport, right, and not making the World Cup is certainly a really good, perhaps example of perhaps what needs to be changed or undone or rethought. It's a very valid point. Right, Columbus is a good example, and you've got a lot of arguers here for pro-rel and the quality of play on the field, and frankly, the business model of MLS, which is still single entity, and despite the whimpering last gasps of the second incarnation of the North American Soccer League, right, is wending its way through the courts, and it could be things around antitrust and all that kind of stuff. But you're right, it's another conversation. Why don't we maybe segue and sort of try to circle the end of this conversation with maybe this. Still not too clear path to the third version, shall we say, of the Earthquakes. They debuted in the spring of 2008. So Wolf got the franchise rights in 2006, and they got the club sort of up and running in albeit a temporary playing situation, but wasn't for a lack of trying. It's interesting to me that the team comes back in 2008. Starts to play, mostly at Buckshaw Stadium at Santa Clara College on a sort of, a temporary and expanded basis. But the new Avaya Stadium that we now know and love and enjoy, and it's an amazing facility, by the way. If you do find yourself in San Jose or near Mineta Airport, you owe it to yourself to go to a game at Avaya Stadium. It is an 18,000-seat cracker box of a stadium with great sight lines and the world's largest outdoor bar with a gigantic screen atop of it for the playing action and stuff. But it took from 2008 not until February 2015. So how does it seems like it was still a challenge, even though Wolf got the team up and running, he got the franchise rights. He was a local owner and somebody who could perhaps make things happen that AEG couldn't. It still took that much time to get a soccer-specific stadium built for the new version of the Earthquakes. Maybe a little bit of a hint about sort of that story.
Yeah, there's several different pieces to this also. Well, one, it takes forever to get anything built in California for anything like this. Okay, first of all, there's a lot of real estate issues. There's a lot of politics. There's a lot. It's right next to the airport, so they had to clear all that stuff. And it's in the neighborhood of a bunch of houses that are far away, but on next to the university. So they were kind of antsy about what they were how they can have a stadium so close to their place. And they all, which are issues. And then the land they're building it on. It's a former military research facility, so there was like bunkers and things underneath the ground that they ran into. So that knocked it back a year, first of all. So that's one component of the whole thing, is just all the bureaucracy and the issues and things like that. And then Wolf is usually the one whose name is thrown around the most on this, but he was basically the lead owner when they came in, and then his son essentially was the point person for a lot of it, whereas Fisher is the guy who basically makes the more large financial decisions when it comes to it. First of all, it's not really Wolf, and then Dave Cavill was the president. He was brought in essentially to be the guy to take the lead and make the stadium happen, and make sure it was a good stadium and not some, cheapskate, third rate, just build whatever you can build as cheaply as possible kind of thing, which is probably what Wolf would have done if he was the only one doing it. I don't mean that in a personal bad way, but that's just how he works. Okay. And so Cavill came in, and he was basically the main lead man responsible for turning the stadium idea into what you see it as now. So he has a good business sense, and some of the fans don't like him for whatever reason, but he's now moved on to the Oakland A's to basically do exactly the same thing, to basically make the stadium happen there. And it's they're basically using our blueprint of how he did this here. Okay. So, and he was really instrumental in making the whole thing happen. He was the guy that put all the pieces together and made sure that it was a much better facility than it probably would have been otherwise.
I got the sense, too, that the actual construction site was a bit problematic as well. That delayed things further.
Yeah, that's what I was just saying. This was on the site across from the airport where the stadium is, was a former FMC plant. There was a lot of military research that was done there. Even as recently as 10 years ago, you could see tanks, rolling across this land, doing stuff, and there was old, munitions and weaponry buried underneath the ground that they dug into when they were building the initial groundbreaking stuff. And, so that is what they drilled into, like some old bunker that they didn't even know was there underneath the ground, and that's what basically delayed it for at least half a year or something. So it was going to open a year earlier, but they couldn't make it work. But
I think by all accounts, a well worth the wait, right? It's a really fun and great stadium, and I think the atmosphere is just I think it's really well done, and I think it's fun, and in some cases, a little bit of a throwback to some of the maybe more earlier, sort of incarnation days of, the family friendly, but certainly just the more fun aspect of the original franchise back in the day.
Yeah, and that definitely played a role into how they were wanting to build it. They don't want, and the 70s was this era of the gigantic, concrete stadiums, and maybe they were used for the Olympics, and there's a track around the whole field, and all these different things that made places horrible to see soccer games in. And even now, if you go to a game at Levi's Stadium, it's horrible to see a soccer game. Or if you even Candlestick, it was just god awful. It just wasn't built for this, And whereas this stadium, it's small, it's 18,000. That's about the top of what they draw, for the season. It's about 18,000. So that's the right size for now. And there's not a bad seat. You can't get lost. It's really small. You can walk around the whole place, circle the whole place in like 10 minutes. There's still some problems. The traffic and the egress and whatever those terms are, how you drive into the place and drive out. It's not always. It's a little convoluted, and they're having problems with VIP lots are not VIP enough, and they just finally paved a lot of the parking lot, and it was so there's a lot of things that are still not really up to speed enough as what they could be. But it's inside the stadium. It's a fantastic place to hang out. It's just it's a great place to see a game.
All right. So as we sort of wrap up here, I get the sense that so you've seen this team in its various incarnations. You've covered sports and the team and other things in the San Jose area for some time. What do you sort of see the franchise's future looking like? It's clear to me that they've spent the last couple of years throwing back a bit. I think I saw a couple of season ticket images that looked back on some of the major events in the team's history back in the 70s and 80s. And, I saw Crazy George was, part of the beginnings of one of the games. And it seems like they've not forgotten their past and almost warmly embraced it, which I guess is a good thing and very refreshing to see.
Yeah, that is a good thing and refreshing to see, and Crazy George was there almost every game this season, but there's still the team on the field was relatively terrible this year, and they weren't that great the year before either. So, and the fans are starting to, and they're raising the season ticket prices every single year, and the team is getting worse every year. They overhauled everything and brought in a new GM, and they will have a new coach next year, and they're signing some really interesting European players that have some personality, and some Latin American players that have some personality, and they have some homegrown local guys that have a lot of personality. So they seem to be gathering the mix pretty well as far as entering a new phase. But it gets very frustrating as a fan because it seems like every year, every season, they're trying to rebuild from the disasters of the previous season. Okay, it never really gets anywhere, So, and then meanwhile, they're raising the season ticket prices and adding more luxury stuff, and they can't fill the stadium, So they're having all the same problems that any franchise has, But the future, I don't know. I mean, I think they have they have what looks like a more personality driven and unique set of players now than I think they've had in the last several years. So we will have to see.
Well, it's a story that
I wish I could be more optimistic than that, but it's really difficult right now.
Well, okay, but it's a story that has further chapters to go, right? So perhaps there's a part two to your book. And Gary, I thank you for this. This has been great. There's a lot of things that I learned sort of in this discussion and the lead up to it about this franchise, and it's got some various and some very interesting little nooks and crannies and turns and stuff that I think people overlook or frankly just forget. But when you go all the way back to the beginnings, what the city and the region was like to what it is today, that's part of the story. The franchise and its history within the league or not a league or a league again. Ownership of the name and the history behind it and the to stadium or not to stadium, and the fans, right? We'll keep forgetting about the fans, right? And their ability to sort of, change the corporate lexicon to keep, the heritage and the history of the team. I mean, all these things are really, really important things, especially if you're a fan of the team now. To not know them or be ignorant of them, I think is an injustice. So kudos to you for covering for this great length of time. Kudos for chronicling the book, which we will promote during the course of the previews of the show. And thank you very much. This has been awesome. I've learned a lot, and I hopefully will get to some other folks like Johnny Moore and perhaps Milan Mandaric and some others who are willing and ready and able to have a conversation even deeper about some more of these interesting stories about the San Jose Earthquakes.
Yeah, I mean, I think the history is important. It's not the only important thing. Obviously, the team on the field now is important too. Okay, but I think between us and Vancouver and Seattle and Portland, those are the only four teams that have a long history like this. The rest of the country doesn't, or the rest of the teams in MLS don't. Okay, and they can manufacture any rivalry they want and manufacture any new franchise and sign whatever player you want. They aren't going to have the history that we have, and that's the cool thing.
All right, I think we're just kind of scratching the surface on some of the little intricacies of that San Jose Earthquakes story, and hopefully we'll have a few other folks to sort of fill in even more of those gaps. We'd love to get Milan Mandaric, certainly. We'd love to get Johnny Moore in there. There's certainly a lot of other characters involved in the San Jose Earthquake story, versions 1, 2, and currently 3, that we'd love to find out more about. And hopefully in conjunction with Gary or aside from, we can go a little bit further in some of these nooks and crannies and untold stories further about arguably one of the more colorful and vivid and fun franchises in not only the NASL but current Major League Soccer as well. Gary Singh is an interesting guy. He's got lots going on, very creative gentleman. He can be found weekly with his column and his writings at the Metro Silicon Valley publication, which is one of the largest, the longest lasting alternative weeklies in the San Jose area. It's Metro Silicon Valley. I think the website for that is metrosiliconvalley.com, strangely enough. Gary's book, as we talked about, is The San Jose Earthquakes, A Seismic Soccer Legacy. You will find that wherever good books are sold, including a link to that book on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search for the episode number 40 with Gary Singh, and you will see a link conveniently there for you to go to Amazon and purchase said book. And all the other stuff that Gary's got going on, you can go to his website. That's Gary Singh, SINGH, .info. That's GarySingh.info. And there you will find all the good stuff in writings and creativity of our guest, Gary Singh, who we thank tremendously for walking us through the San Jose Earthquake story. For you completists out there, we mentioned a couple of previous guests and the episodes that they were on. And episode number 7 is where you'll find our chat with Crazy George Henderson, who was obviously a part of the fun and frivolity in the early days, and frankly, even the current days of the San Jose Earthquakes in the stands. A great conversation there. Episode 22 is worth your listening to as well. That's our episode with Dan Gordon, who crafted the very fine documentary film about the life of George Best, and in which you will see that highlight that we discussed in our conversation with Gary here of George Best, and arguably his and maybe the NASL's greatest ever goal in July of 1981 at Spartan Stadium. It's quite a sight to see, and it's George Best, maybe past his prime, but the glimpses of brilliance are absolutely on display in that clip and in that movie, and that's with Dan Gordon, who had the movie that was an ESPN 30 for 30, and that's our episode number 32. And of course, don't forget episode 35, which was our very fun and rollicking interview with Paul Child, one of the first true stars of the original San Jose Earthquakes in 1974. And that's a fun journey as well into Paul's life and career, much of which got a very heady start in earnest when he was part of the San Jose Earthquakes of the mid and late 1970s. So give all those previous episodes a listen. I think you'll enjoy, and it'll help further tell this fuller story of the Earthquakes, and obviously more hopefully to come with other guests as we wend our way through our journey together into forgotten sports lore and history. Let's see. So our website is goodseatsstillavailable.com. As I said, please go there early and often. That's where you'll find every single one of our past episodes. You will find all the links to our various social media. You can click into getting all the various media that we talk about on this show, whether it's books or CDs or videos or whatever. That's where you can find all that good stuff. And on social media directly, you can go to Facebook and like us there. You can go to Instagram at Good Seats Still Available and follow us there. And of course on Twitter at Good Seats Still. That's our little handle there. You can follow us and tweet at us as well. Okay, I think I've exhausted myself and our guests and probably you as the listeners. So thank you for listening. We always appreciate it, and we look forward to talking to you again next week for another fun-filled episode. Until then, drive safely, everybody. Take care.